Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Amin. When opposition leader Bobi Wine stood before European lawmakers calling for targeted sanctions against officials in Kampala, the moment carried echoes far beyond Uganda. It raised a sharper, more uncomfortable question. Could Uganda be drifting toward a model of entrenched rule and international isolation resembling that of Alexander Lukashenko's Belarus? The comparison is not perfect, and history rarely repeats itself neatly. Yet the language of targeted sanctions, engagement versus isolation, and regime survival has begun to frame discussions about Uganda in ways once reserved for post-Soviet strongholds. Before we proceed, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow and reach more people like you. Tell us where are you watching us from, and don't hesitate to comment. Make sure that I read all your comments. Drop your opinions below. Make sure to watch the video till the end. Uganda has been governed for nearly 4 decades by President Yoweri Museveni, whose political longevity has reshaped the country's institutions around executive dominance. Over time, constitutional term limits were removed, political competition narrowed, and security forces assumed an increasingly visible role in managing dissent. The 2021 elections, in which Bobi Wine emerged as a formidable challenger, were marked by allegations of repression, restrictions on media, and the detention of opposition supporters. Although the government rejected claims of systematic abuse, international observers and rights organizations raised concerns about shrinking civic space. The Belarus comparison arises not because Uganda mirrors Minsk structurally, but because both cases illustrate what analysts call survival politics, a governing logic focused less on reform and more on maintaining control under pressure. In Belarus, Lukashenko weathered mass protests in 2020 through a combination of security crackdowns, legal maneuvers, and reliance on geopolitical backing from Russia. European Union sanctions followed, targeting individuals and entities accused of human rights violations. The regime did not fall. It adapted, isolation deepened, domestic repression intensified, and the state recalibrated its alliances. Uganda's geopolitical position differs significantly. It is not situated in a binary confrontation between great powers in the way Belarus is between the EU and Russia. Kampala maintains strategic relationships with Western governments, particularly in security cooperation across East Africa and in peacekeeping operations. This complicates the sanctions debate. Unlike Belarus, where alignment with Moscow provided a buffer against Western pressure, Uganda occupies a more diversified diplomatic landscape. The European Union and the United States remain important economic and development partners, even as Kampala strengthens ties with other global actors. Yet, the internal political mechanics invite comparison. Calls for targeted sanctions under instruments such as the Global Magnitsky Framework reflect a belief among opposition figures that external pressure could shift incentives within the ruling elite. The theory is straightforward. If key officials face travel bans, asset freezes, and reputational costs, they may recalibrate behavior. Critics argue, however, that sanctions risk entrenching hardliners and reinforcing nationalist narratives of foreign interference. Belarus demonstrated that when leadership frames sanctions as external aggression, domestic repression can be justified as defensive necessity. For Uganda, the question becomes whether international pressure would encourage reform or accelerate consolidation. The government has historically balanced coercion with selective accommodation. Civil society organizations operate, albeit under tighter regulation. Elections occur, though opposition actors contest their fairness. The system retains procedural elements of democracy, even as critics argue that substantive competition has eroded. This hybridity complicates any linear comparison to Belarus, where post-2020 repression dramatically narrowed the space for pluralism. Another key factor is economic resilience. Belarus's state-centered economy and Russian financial backing enabled it to absorb sanctions without immediate collapse. Uganda's economy, more reliant on foreign aid, trade access, and international financial institutions, could face different pressures. Conditional aid, tying development cooperation to governance benchmarks, has been proposed by some European voices as a calibrated alternative to sweeping sanctions. Whether such conditions translate into tangible reforms depends on domestic political calculations. Does the ruling coalition perceive reform as safer than resistance? Security dynamics also shape survival politics. Uganda's leadership has long positioned itself as a guarantor of regional stability, particularly in volatile neighboring states. The security narrative strengthens its bargaining position internationally. Belarus, too, leveraged security arguments, portraying unrest as externally orchestrated. In both contexts, the framing of opposition movements matters. If dissent is depicted as destabilizing rather than democratic, governments gain rhetorical ground in resisting pressure. However, there are limits to the Belarus analogy. Uganda's civil society, religious institutions, and youthful democratic create a distinct political ecosystem. Public debate, though constrained, remains visible. The opposition retains domestic resonance. In Belarus, post-protest repression pushed much of the opposition into exile. Uganda has not crossed that threshold. The trajectory is therefore uncertain rather than predetermined. Ultimately, the comparison illuminates broader questions about the European Union's leverage. Sanctions have symbolic force, signaling normative disapproval. Yet their transformative capacity depends on alignment of economic vulnerability, elite cohesion, and geopolitical alternatives. In Belarus, sanctions produced isolation, but not systemic reform. For Uganda, outcomes would hinge on whether pressure fractures or fortifies the ruling structure. Could Uganda become the next Belarus? The answer lies less in imitation than in incentives. If political survival is defined narrowly through control of security forces, legal adjustments, and resistance to external critique, the parallels may deepen. If, however, internal and external pressures converge to make reform a safer path than rigidity, divergence remains possible. Uganda stands at a crossroads shaped by power calculations, international scrutiny, and the enduring tension between stability and accountability. For observers and policymakers alike, the lesson from Belarus is sobering. Sanctions alone rarely engineer democratic transition. They reshape environments, alter alliances, and test resilience. Whether Uganda's future resembles Minsk's hardened isolation or charts a distinct course will depend on how its leaders interpret pressure, not merely as threat but as signal. As global politics grows more polarized, the politics of survival may define more regimes. The real question is whether survival can coexist with meaningful political opening. Thank you for watching. If you value in-depth political analysis and clear breakdowns of global developments, make sure you stay connected. This is KKTV Uganda, where we follow the story beyond the headlines. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and I'll see you in the next one.